It was the kind of Saturday morning that makes Ohio feel like the most beautiful place on earth. The sky was a clean, endless blue, the kind that only shows up in late spring when the last chill of winter has finally given up and gone home. Birds were loud in the oak trees lining Riverside Park, and the smell of fresh cut grass mixed with the distant sweetness of funnel cake drifting from a food cart near the park entrance. Families poured in from every direction, strollers and folding chairs and laughing children filling the wide open space with the comfortable noise of a community that felt safe. Claire Matthews had almost not come. The night before, she had been exhausted. Lily had refused to sleep before 11, had knocked over a full glass of water onto the kitchen floor, and had asked the question, "But why?" approximately 47 times in a single hour. Claire was a single mother, working 4 days a week as a dental hygienist and spending the other 3 days trying to be everything her daughter needed. She was 29 years old, and some mornings she felt 60. But her neighbor Janet had mentioned the Community Safety Day at Riverside Park weeks ago and had said it would be good for Lily, good for her, good for both of them to just get outside and breathe and be part of something. So Claire packed the small purple backpack. She filled it with Lily's favorite crackers, a spare shirt, 2 juice boxes, and a small stuffed rabbit named Benny that Lily occasionally needed for emotional support in overwhelming situations. She buckled Lily into her car seat, kissed her on the forehead, and drove the 11 minutes to Riverside Park with the windows down and a country song playing low on the radio. Lily was already bouncing in her seat before they even parked. The park was transformed. Fire trucks gleamed under the morning sun, their red paint polished so bright it almost hurt to look at. Uniformed officers stood at information tables, handing out stickers and plastic badges to wide-eyed children. An ambulance crew demonstrated CPR on a dummy while a small crowd gathered and watched. There were games, face painting, a K-9 demonstration area roped off with orange cones near the east side of the park, and enough going on that Claire immediately felt the tension in her shoulders begin to loosen. She held Lily's hand as they walked through the entrance, stopping to let a volunteer stamp a small paw print on the back of Lily's hand. Lily stared at it for a full 30 seconds with the kind of intense concentration only a toddler can give to something completely insignificant. Then she looked up at her mother with enormous eyes and whispered, "A dog did that." Claire laughed for the first time all day. They moved through the crowd slowly, stopping at every table, every display, every uniformed officer willing to crouch down and say hello to a curly-haired 3-year-old who had absolutely no concept of personal boundaries. Lily touched a firefighter's helmet. She sat briefly inside a patrol car and honked the horn once before Claire snatched her back out. She ate an entire juice box in under a minute and immediately asked for the second one. Everything was perfect and ordinary and good. And then Deputy Marcus Webb pulled into the parking lot. He came in a dark blue Sheriff's Department SUV, moving slowly through the lot and parking near the east side entrance closest to the K-9 demonstration zone. Deputy Webb was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with a calm face that had seen enough over 15 years in law enforcement to rarely show surprise. He had a quiet authority about him, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. He had been doing community outreach events with Ranger for 3 years and knew the routine well. Set up the demonstration area, answer questions, let the kids see that a police dog is a partner, not a weapon, go home, simple. He opened the back of the SUV, and Ranger jumped down onto the asphalt. Ranger was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 70 pounds of muscle, focus, and controlled energy. His coat was a rich tan and black, his ears permanently upright and alert, his dark eyes scanning the environment the moment his paws hit the ground. He was not a pet. He was a working animal, certified in narcotics detection, tracking, and apprehension, with a service record that would make most officers proud. Children who came to demonstrations were always told to wait, to ask, to never approach a working dog without permission. There were signs on the orange cones that said as much. Nobody told Lily. Claire had stopped at a table 30 feet away to pick up a brochure about home fire safety when she felt the small, warm hand in hers simply disappear. She looked down. Empty air. She turned around in a full circle, the brochure falling from her fingers, her heart lurching into her throat the way it does for every parent in that single terrible second when a child is simply gone. Then she heard the laugh. It was Lily's laugh, unmistakable, that high and breathless giggle that meant she had found something that delighted her completely. Claire spun toward the sound and felt the blood drain from her face. Lily was standing 3 feet in front of Ranger. Her juice box was on the grass. Her arms were out at her sides like small wings. She was looking directly into the face of a 70-pound police dog with the absolute fearlessness that only exists in people who are either very brave or very young and have no idea what danger looks like. Every officer nearby had gone still. Deputy Webb's hand was raised, a silent signal, every muscle in his body locked and ready. The whole world seemed to pause and hold its breath. And then Ranger did something that changed everything. Time did not stop, but it slowed. Every person standing within 20 feet of that moment felt it. The kind of slow that happens when something is about to occur that cannot be undone, when the air itself seems to thicken, and every sound around you fades into a distant hum. Officers who had been laughing at a nearby table turned and went quiet. A mother pushing a stroller stopped walking mid-step. A young boy holding a plastic badge forgot to breathe. Even the birds in the oak trees above seemed to pause their singing, as though nature itself had leaned in to watch. Deputy Marcus Webb stood completely frozen. In 15 years of law enforcement and 3 years of K-9 community outreach, he had never once seen a child break through the barrier and approach Ranger without permission. It simply did not happen. The orange cones, the signs, the officers stationed nearby, the trained instinct of parents to hold their children back, all of it created a system that worked without fail. Until today. Until Lily Matthews, 3 years old, curly-haired, juice box abandoned in the grass, decided that rules were a concept that simply did not apply to her. Webb's right hand was still raised in the silent command signal he had thrown up the moment he saw her moving. His eyes were locked on Ranger. His breathing was controlled, steady, the way they train you to breathe when everything around you is not. His mind was running calculations at a speed that 15 years of experience had made automatic. Distance between child and dog. Ranger's current stress level. Noise level in the environment. Wind direction. The body language of the crowd. His own distance from the animal. Everything told him to move. But Ranger told him to wait. Because in that extraordinary moment, something happened inside that 70-pound Belgian Malinois that no training manual had ever fully predicted and no certification course had ever guaranteed. Ranger, who had taken down fleeing suspects and located hidden narcotics in locked vehicles, and worked through environments that would overwhelm most animals, looked at Lily Matthews and made a decision entirely his own. He sat down. Not the sharp, snapping sit of a dog responding to a command. Not the tense, coiled sit of an animal calculating its next move. It was slow and deliberate, almost gentle, like a large person carefully lowering themselves into a chair so they don't startle someone nearby. His haunches touched the grass. His spine straightened. His head, which had been raised and alert, dropped slightly, just enough to bring his eyes closer to the level of the small human standing in front of him. His ears, almost always stiff and forward in public environments, relaxed backward by the smallest degree. And his tail began to wag. Deputy Webb exhaled so slowly it was barely visible. Lily took one more step forward. She was close enough now to reach out and touch him, and everyone watching knew that was exactly what she was going to do because nothing about this child suggested she had ever once talked herself out of something she wanted. Her small arm extended, fingers spread wide the way children always reach for animals, open and honest and completely without hesitation. Her eyes were enormous, fixed on Ranger's face with an expression of pure wonder that was almost too beautiful to watch. Her fingertips touched the top of Ranger's head. The crowd released a collective breath that sounded like wind moving through tall grass. Ranger closed his eyes. For a long moment nobody moved and nobody spoke. Claire Matthews had arrived at the edge of the scene, her face white, both hands pressed over her mouth, tears already forming in the corners of her eyes. She had come running the moment she spotted Lily and had stopped herself from screaming a second time only because she could see, even from a distance, that something tender was happening, and she was terrified that a sudden noise would shatter it. So she stood and shook and watched her daughter do the bravest and most innocent thing she had ever seen. Lily used both hands now. She placed her small palms on either side of Ranger's big head the way you might hold the face of someone you love, and she leaned forward until her nose was just inches from his, and she said, in the matter-of-fact tone that 3-year-olds use for the most profound observations, "Hi, doggy. I like you." Ranger licked her nose. Lily exploded into laughter. The crowd exploded with her. What had been a tense, held-breath silence transformed in an instant into something warm and loud and completely joyful. People clapped. Someone cheered. A woman nearby started crying openly and didn't seem embarrassed about it at all. Officers who had been rigid with tension were suddenly grinning at each other with the specific relief of people who had prepared for disaster and received a miracle instead. Deputy Webb lowered his hand, pressed it briefly over his own chest, and allowed himself a long, slow smile that started somewhere deep and worked its way to the surface. He walked forward calmly and knelt beside Ranger, one hand resting on the dog's back, his eyes moving between his partner and the small girl who had just walked through every invisible boundary like they were made of air. "His name is Ranger," Webb said quietly. Lily looked up at him with absolute seriousness. "I know," she said. "He told me." Webb laughed out loud. He could not help it. Claire finally reached her daughter and dropped to her knees on the grass, pulling Lily into her arms and holding her with the fierce tightness of a mother who had just aged 10 years in 45 seconds. Lily patted her mother's back patiently, the way children do when they believe the adults around them are overreacting. "Mama," Lily said calmly, "the dog is nice." 30 feet away, a father named Daniel Hooper had his phone raised and had been recording since the moment Lily's fingers first touched Ranger's head. He watched the whole scene through his screen with a full heart and steady hands, somehow knowing without being told that what he had just witnessed was something rare, something that needed to be saved and shared and seen by people far beyond this park. That night, sitting at his kitchen table after his own kids were in bed, he uploaded the video with shaking hands and a simple caption that felt exactly right. She wasn't afraid, and neither was he. He set his phone down, poured himself a glass of water, and went to bed. By the time his alarm went off the next morning, 11 million people had watched his video. And the world was already talking about Lily and Ranger. Daniel Hooper was not a man who chased attention. He was 36 years old, a high school history teacher from the west side of Columbus, Ohio, who coached junior varsity soccer on weekends and made his own pasta on Sunday nights. He had 412 followers on his social media account, most of them former students, a handful of family members, and 3 people he was fairly certain had added him by accident. He posted maybe twice a month. A sunset here, a photo of his kids at a birthday party there. Nothing that had ever broken 50 likes. So when he woke up Monday morning at 6:15 and reached for his phone on the nightstand out of pure habit, he was not prepared for what he found. His screen was a wall of notifications. He sat up slowly, squinting, certain he was misreading something. The number next to his video post had too many digits. He counted them twice. Then he sat on the edge of his bed in his old gray t-shirt and soccer shorts and stared at 11 million views like a man who had just been told something in a language he understood but could not quite believe. His wife rolled over behind him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said, and then after a long pause, "Everything." By the time Daniel was drinking his first cup of coffee, the video had been shared by 4 of the largest news accounts in the country. By the time he was dropping his kids at school, morning television producers across America were already making calls, tracking down the location, identifying the sheriff's department, and searching for the name of the little girl with the curly hair and the fearless hands. By the time Daniel pulled into the school parking lot and sat in his car for an extra 5 minutes trying to process what was happening, the video had crossed 15 million views and was still climbing like it had no intention of stopping. Inside the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, the phone lines were ringing in a way that Deputy Marcus Webb had never experienced in 15 years of service. He arrived at the station that Monday morning at his usual time, 7:45, coffee in one hand and Ranger's leash in the other, expecting a normal week. What he found instead was his captain standing in the hallway with an expression that sat somewhere between amused and overwhelmed, holding a printed sheet of paper with a list of media requests that was already 2 pages long. "Good morning," Captain Elaine Torres said, handing him the list. Webb looked at it, looked at Ranger, looked back at the list. "Is this about Saturday?" he asked. 11 major television networks, Torres said, 4 national newspapers, 2 international wire services, and a morning talk show that wants you and Ranger on set by Wednesday. She paused. "In New York." Webb folded the list carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked down at Ranger, who was sitting calmly at his left side, completely unbothered, watching a moth near the fluorescent ceiling light with mild professional interest. "He doesn't like flying," Webb said. Torres stared at him, then she burst out laughing. But the media did not wait for anyone's comfort level. Within hours, reporters had set up outside the Franklin County Sheriff's Department with cameras and microphones, and the particular brand of cheerful persistence that television journalists bring to stories they know the public has already fallen in love with. Webb gave a brief statement on the front steps that afternoon, standing straight in his uniform with Ranger beside him, choosing his words with the careful economy of a man who had never wanted to be famous. He said that Ranger was an exceptional animal and an exceptional partner. He said that the little girl had shown more courage than most adults he had met. He said that moments like Saturday were exactly why community outreach mattered. He thanked Daniel Hooper for capturing it. He did not take questions. It did not matter. The story was already writing itself without him. The video had reached 22 million views by Tuesday morning. Morning show hosts across the country played the clip on their studio screens and reacted with the kind of unguarded emotion that daytime television is built on. Anchors who had spent the previous segment discussing budget deficits and international tensions visibly softened when the video played, leaning toward their screens, pressing hands to hearts, turning to their co-hosts with wide eyes. One anchor on a nationally syndicated show began crying mid-segment and apologized twice before giving up apologizing entirely and just letting the tears fall, which only made the clip of her reaction go viral as a second separate wave. Social media was a flood. People shared the video with captions that ranged from the simple, "I needed this today," to the elaborate, entire paragraphs from strangers processing why a 3-year-old and a police dog had made them feel something they hadn't felt in years. Parents shared it for their children. Veterans shared it with comments about the loyalty of working dogs. Teachers showed it in classrooms. A dog trainer in Seattle shared it with a lengthy professional breakdown of Ranger's body language that was itself shared over 1 million times. A poet in Nashville wrote 12 lines about the moment and posted them alongside a screenshot of the video, and received more attention for those 12 lines than anything she had ever written before. The world, it seemed, was desperately hungry for exactly this. For something uncomplicated and pure. For a story with no villain and no agenda. For a moment that did not require analysis or debate, that simply said something true about the capacity for connection between creatures who have no reason to trust each other and choose to anyway. But not everyone felt that way. On Tuesday afternoon, a nonprofit organization called Safe Spaces for Children published a formal statement on their website that moved through social media like a cold wind through an open window. The statement was carefully worded, professionally presented, and deeply serious in its tone. It acknowledged the emotional appeal of the video, while firmly arguing that the presence of an active, working law enforcement K-9 unit at a public family event, surrounded by toddlers and young children, represented a significant and inexcusable lapse in public safety judgment. The statement cited statistics. It referenced prior incidents in other states involving police dogs and bystanders. It named specific protocol standards that it claimed had been ignored. It called on the Franklin County Sheriff's Department to issue a formal review of its community outreach guidelines. And at the very bottom, in language that was measured but unmistakable, it announced that the organization was consulting with legal counsel regarding potential next steps. The comments section beneath the statement became a war zone within the hour. People who had been sharing the video with heart emojis an hour earlier were suddenly typing in capital letters. Deputy Webb supporters flooded the organization's page with furious responses. Supporters of the organization responded with equal intensity. News outlets that had spent 2 days running the story as a feel-good human interest piece suddenly smelled something more complex and began sharpening their coverage accordingly. Claire Matthews sat on her couch that Tuesday evening with Lily asleep on her lap, her phone buzzing continuously on the cushion beside her, reading the statement from Safe Spaces for Children for the 3rd time. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were tired. Lily's small chest rose and fell with the deep, steady breathing of a child who had no idea that her 30 seconds of fearless curiosity had lit a fire that was now burning in every direction. Claire set her phone face down on the couch. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she picked the phone back up, opened her contacts, and scrolled to the name of her older brother, who happened to be a practicing attorney in downtown Columbus. She pressed call. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Did you see the video?" she asked. "The whole country saw the video," he said. "They're talking about suing the sheriff's department," Claire said. A pause. "I saw that too. What do I do?" Another pause, longer this time. When her brother spoke again, his voice had shifted from casual to careful in the way that attorneys shift when something has moved from conversation into consequence. "First thing you do," he said, "is stop talking to the media." Claire closed her eyes. Outside, the Ohio night was quiet and warm and completely indifferent to the storm that was gathering around one small family, one police dog, and one 30-second video that the whole world could not stop watching. The legal papers arrived on a Thursday morning. Not dramatically, not with cameras rolling or reporters waiting on the steps. They arrived the way most life-changing documents arrive, quietly, carried by an ordinary process server in a gray sedan who parked in the visitor lot of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department at 9:14 in the morning, walked through the front door with a manila envelope, asked for Captain Elaine Torres by name, handed her the envelope with a polite nod, and walked back out to his car without a word. Torres stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the envelope. Then she walked directly to Sheriff Donald Greer's office, knocked twice, and set it on his desk without sitting down. Greer was 61 years old, 28 years in law enforcement, a man who had handled hostage situations and natural disasters and budget crises and political pressure from 3 different county administrations. He was not easily rattled. He picked up the envelope, opened it with the small brass letter opener his daughter had given him for Christmas 7 years ago, and read through the document slowly and completely before he said a single word. When he finished, he set the papers flat on his desk, folded his hands on top of them, and looked at Tors with the steady eyes of a man who had been waiting for something like this since the moment the video went viral. "Get Webb," he said, "and call the county attorney." The lawsuit filed by Safe Spaces for Children was 43 pages long. It named Franklin County, the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, Sheriff Donald Greer in his official capacity, and Deputy Marcus Webb individually as defendants. It alleged that the decision to bring an active working K-9 unit to a public community event attended by families with young children constituted negligent endangerment of the public. It argued that proper safety barriers had not been maintained, that adequate warning signage had been insufficient, and that the supervising officer had failed to maintain appropriate control of the animal at the critical moment, when a toddler breached the designated safety perimeter. It requested a formal injunction preventing K-9 units from participating in public community events until new safety protocols were established and approved. It requested compensatory damages, and it requested that the court order a full independent review of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department's K-9 community outreach program. Webb read the lawsuit sitting in Sheriff Greer's office with Ranger lying at his feet. He read it the way you read something that has your name on it in a context you never imagined, slowly, carefully, with a growing stillness in your chest that is not quite anger and not quite fear, but lives somewhere uncomfortably between the two. When he finished, he set the papers on the edge of Greer's desk and was quiet for a long moment. "They're saying I put children at risk," he said. "That's what they're saying," Greer confirmed. Webb looked down at Ranger. Ranger looked back up at him with the calm, devoted attention that the dog gave him in every situation regardless of what was happening around them. Webb reached down and placed one hand on Ranger's back. "He sat down," Webb said quietly. "He made the choice to sit down." "I know," Greer said. "I didn't command him to, he just did it." "I know that too," Greer said, "and we're going to make sure the court knows it as well." The county attorney, a methodical and experienced woman named Patricia Hale, arrived within the hour and spent 3 hours with Greer, Tors, and Webb going through every detail of the community safety day. She asked for Ranger's full certification records, his training history, his incident reports, his annual behavioral assessments, and every piece of documentation the department had on its K-9 outreach program. She asked Webb to walk her through the exact sequence of events from the moment he parked his SUV to the moment Lily touched Ranger's head. She asked him 3 times in 3 different ways whether he had at any point lost direct visual contact with Ranger before the child approached. Each time, Webb answered the same way. Clearly, honestly, without hesitation. Hale made notes in a leather-bound notebook and said very little until she was finished. Then she closed the notebook, looked at Greer, and said the words that every defendant needs to hear from their attorney at the beginning of a fight. "We have a strong case," she said, "but this is going to get louder before it gets quieter." She was not wrong. The news that Safe Spaces for Children had filed a formal lawsuit broke that same Thursday afternoon, and the reaction was immediate and enormous. The story, which had already been running on a second wave of media attention since the organization's statement earlier in the week, now ignited into something that felt less like a news cycle and more like a cultural argument that the entire country had been waiting for an excuse to have. Cable news panels filled with voices debating police dog safety, community policing, the responsibilities of law enforcement at public events, and the rights of advocacy organizations to pursue legal action on behalf of public safety. Opinion pieces appeared in major newspapers within 24 hours, written from every conceivable angle. A retired K-9 trainer wrote a 1,200-word piece defending Ranger's behavior as a demonstration of elite temperament. A child safety advocate wrote an equally long piece arguing that good outcomes do not retroactively eliminate negligent conditions. Social media, which had been a warm and emotional place just days before, became something sharper and louder and more divided. The hashtag supporting Deputy Webb and Ranger trended nationally. A counter hashtag supporting the lawsuit trended almost simultaneously. People who had never met each other argued in comment sections with the intensity of people who had. Former law enforcement officers posted videos. Parents posted responses. Dog trainers weighed in. Lawyers weighed in. Everyone, it seemed, had a position and was not interested in being talked out of it. Through all of it, Deputy Webb said nothing publicly. He came to work. He cared for Ranger. He met with Patricia Hale 3 more times over the following 2 weeks as the case moved through its preliminary stages. He drove past the cameras that had taken up a semi-permanent position outside the department and kept his eyes straight ahead and his expression neutral. His captain had advised him not to speak to the media, and he had agreed without argument, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned long ago that the loudest rooms are rarely the ones where truth is best heard. Claire Matthews, meanwhile, was navigating something far more complicated than a legal battle. She was navigating the strange and disorienting experience of having her private life become public property. Her address had been found and published by an anonymous account online, forcing her to temporarily stay with her brother. Strangers sent her messages that ranged from deeply kind to genuinely threatening. Journalists knocked on her neighbors' doors. A television producer sent flowers to her workplace with a note asking for an exclusive interview. She declined everything, following her brother's advice with a discipline born of genuine fear for her daughter. Lily, for her part, remained magnificently unconcerned. She asked about Ranger every single day. She drew pictures of him in crayon, large brown and black shapes that Claire taped to the refrigerator with a full heart. She told her stuffed rabbit Benny detailed stories about her friend the big dog at the park. She asked her mother twice when they could go back and see him. Claire always answered the same way. "Soon, baby," she would say, "soon." But the truth was that Claire Matthews had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Because 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, a court date was set, and the case of Safe Spaces for Children versus Franklin County was officially assigned to the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Patricia Sims, a woman known throughout the Ohio legal community for 2 things above all others: her complete impartiality and her absolute refusal to let a courtroom become a circus. She was about to be tested on both counts. Because the whole country was already buying tickets, the morning of the trial arrived the way important mornings always do. Too quickly and with too much light. Deputy Marcus Webb was awake before his alarm at 4:45, sitting at his kitchen table in the dark with a cup of coffee. He had made more out of habit than desire, staring at nothing in particular, while Ranger slept on his mat in the corner of the room with the deep, unbothered peace of an animal that does not understand court dates or public pressure, or the weight of having your name on a lawsuit. Webb watched him sleep for a while. He found it steadying in a way he could not have explained to anyone. He had laid his dress uniform out the night before, pressed and perfect, hanging on the back of his bedroom door like a second version of himself waiting to be stepped into. He had polished his boots until he could see his own face in them. He had trimmed his beard carefully, shorter than usual, because Patricia Hale had suggested it without quite saying why, and he had understood without needing her to. First impressions, she had told him in their final meeting 2 days prior, are not just for juries. They are for the entire room. And in this case, the entire room included cameras, reporters, a packed public gallery, and a judge who had already made clear through her clerk that she would tolerate exactly 0 theatrics from any party. Webb dressed slowly. He drank his coffee. He fed Ranger and walked him in the dark quiet of the early morning, the two of them moving down the empty sidewalk in a familiar rhythm that felt like the most normal thing in a week that had contained very little that was normal. The neighborhood was still asleep. A sprinkler ran in someone's yard across the street. A cat watched them from a porch railing with supreme indifference. Webb looked up at the sky, which was just beginning to show the first pale suggestion of morning along the eastern edge. He thought about Lily Matthews and her juice box in the grass. He thought about how none of this would exist if Ranger had simply done what working dogs are trained to do in unexpected situations, which is hold position and wait for a command. Instead, Ranger had done something that could not be trained into an animal and could not be trained out of one either. He had responded to a child with gentleness because something inside him recognized that gentleness was what the moment required. And now they were here, standing in the gray pre-dawn of a Thursday morning in Columbus, Ohio, about to walk into a courthouse that the entire country was watching. Webb looked down at Ranger. "Let's go be honest," he said quietly. Ranger looked up at him and wagged his tail once. The Franklin County Court of Common Pleas was a large stone building on Mound Street that had stood since 1928 and carried the particular gravity of old courthouses everywhere, the kind of weight that comes from nearly a century of human consequence passing through its doors. By 7:30 in the morning, 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, there were already people lined up along the sidewalk outside, hopping for one of the limited public gallery seats. Camera crews had claimed their designated positions along the press line. Satellite trucks were parked in a row along the street, their dishes raised toward the sky like an audience looking up at something. Inside, the courtroom itself was already humming, with the controlled tension of a room that knows it is being watched. Patricia Hale arrived at 8 and sat up at the defense table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and understood that composure at the table communicates something to a jury before a single word is spoken. She arranged her documents in a precise order, set 2 sharpened pencils parallel to her notepad, and reviewed her opening statement one final time with the focused calm of an athlete preparing to compete. Across the aisle, Diana Cross was doing the same. Diana Cross was 44 years old, a litigator with 17 years of experience and a reputation in Ohio legal circles for being exceptionally prepared and exceptionally difficult to rattle. She was tall, sharp-featured, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes not from arrogance but from having done the work. She believed in her case. She believed that regardless of how the video had made people feel, the legal question before the court was a serious one that deserved serious treatment. She had spent 3 weeks building an argument that she intended to make impossible to dismiss on sentiment alone. She had statistics, she had precedents, she had expert witnesses whose credentials were unimpeachable. What she had not fully anticipated was the human element that would walk through the courtroom doors at 8:59 and fundamentally alter the temperature of the room. Deputy Webb entered in full dress uniform with Ranger walking at perfect heel position on his left side. The K-9 would wait in the secure vehicle bay during proceedings and be brought in only if the defense motion was approved. But Webb had requested permission to enter with Ranger and walk him through the main corridor before securing him, and Judge Sims had allowed it through her clerk without comment. The effect was immediate and undeniable. The public gallery, which had been buzzing with the low, urgent conversation of a crowd waiting for something significant, went almost completely silent as Webb and Ranger moved down the center aisle. It was not a dramatic silence, not the theatrical hush of a movie moment. It was something more genuine than that. It was the silence of people who had watched a video 11 million times and were now seeing the subject of that video in person for the first time, and finding that he was exactly what they had hoped he would be. Webb kept his eyes forward. Ranger kept perfect position. They reached the front of the room. Webb nodded once to Patricia Hale, and then turned and walked Ranger back out through the side door to the secure bay. Diana Cross watched the whole thing from her table without expression. But her assistant, a young second-year associate sitting to her left, leaned toward her and whispered, "That was smart." Cross did not respond, but she made a small note on her legal pad. Judge Patricia Sims entered at 9 o'clock precisely. She was 63 years old, small in stature but large in presence, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck that she deployed with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for fumbling. She had been on the bench for 19 years. She had presided over murder trials, corruption cases, and custody battles that had broken families in half. She had never once allowed a courtroom under her authority to become something other than what it was supposed to be, which was a place where facts were examined and law was applied. She sat, she looked at both tables, she looked at the gallery, she looked at the cameras in their designated positions. "We are here," she said, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft but simply clear, "to examine a legal question, not to relitigate public opinion, not to perform for an audience, and not to be moved by sentiment in either direction." She paused. "Is that understood by all parties?" Both attorneys said yes. "Good," said Judge Sims. "Then let's begin." Diana Cross rose for her opening statement, and the courtroom went still. She was measured, precise, and deliberately unemotional. She acknowledged the video. She acknowledged that the moment it captured was touching. She then pivoted with the practiced efficiency of a skilled litigator and spent the next 22 minutes presenting a picture not of one sweet moment, but of a system of decisions that had led to that moment. Decisions she argued were negligent, short-sighted, and preventable. She showed charts. She cited 3 prior incidents in other states involving police dogs at public events. She walked the jury through the specific safety protocols that govern K-9 presence at public gatherings and pointed to each place where she argued those protocols had fallen short on the day in question. She was compelling, she was professional, she was good. Then Patricia Hale stood up. She did not use charts. She did not cite statistics in her opening. She stood at the front of the courtroom with her hands clasped in front of her, and she told the jury one simple thing. "You are going to hear a great deal of numbers and protocols and prior incidents over the coming days," she said, "and you should listen to all of it carefully because it deserves careful attention." She paused, letting the silence work for her. "But I am also going to ask you to remember one thing throughout this trial. On that Saturday morning in Riverside Park, when a 3-year-old child walked toward a police dog, the dog made a choice." Another pause. "And that choice tells you everything you need to know about this case." She sat down. In the front row of the public gallery, Claire Matthews pressed her hand over her mouth. And in the secure vehicle bay 2 corridors away, Ranger lay on his mat, quiet and patient, waiting for whatever came next. The second day of the trial began with rain. It came in overnight, a slow and steady Ohio rain that darkened the stone face of the courthouse and turned the sidewalks outside into rivers of reflected light from the camera crews, who had kept their positions through the night in rotating shifts, unwilling to risk missing a single moment of a story that had already defied every expectation they had brought to it. By 7 in the morning, the press line outside was a forest of umbrellas, and the satellite trucks had their wipers running in a slow, patient rhythm that matched the mood of the morning exactly. Inside, the courtroom was already full. Every seat in the public gallery had been claimed before 8 o'clock. The overflow crowd filled the hallway outside and spilled down the steps where a deputy sheriff managed the line, with the patient exhaustion of someone who had been doing it since 6. People had driven from neighboring counties. A retired judge from Cincinnati had come simply to observe, sitting in the back row with a notepad and reading glasses, watching everything with the quiet attention of someone who understood exactly how rare this was. Because day 2 of the trial had already produced something that courtroom veterans were struggling to find precedent for. It had begun the previous afternoon, in the final hour of day 1, When Patricia Hale had risen and addressed Judge Sims with a motion that produced an audible reaction from everyone in the room who heard it clearly, which was everyone. She had requested that Ranger be brought into the courtroom. Not as a stunt, not as theater, as a demonstration of material evidence, specifically the temperament, training, and behavioral character of the animal at the center of the case. She argued that no amount of documentation or expert testimony could communicate to a jury what a direct observation of the animal could communicate, and that denying the jury that opportunity was denying them access to the most relevant evidence in the entire proceeding. Diana Cross had objected immediately and forcefully, arguing that bringing a working police dog into a courtroom full of people was itself a demonstration of the exact recklessness her case was built around. She argued it was prejudicial, emotionally manipulative, and legally unnecessary given the volume of documented evidence already entered. Judge Sims had listened to both arguments without expression. Then she had removed her reading glasses from her nose, set them on the chain around her neck, looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, and said 7 words that the court reporter would later describe as the calmest bombshell she had ever transcribed. "I'll allow it first thing tomorrow morning." The courtroom had reacted the way courtrooms are not supposed to react, with noise, with movement, with the kind of electric collective response that Judge Sims immediately silenced with a single sharp strike of her gavel, and a look that required no words whatsoever. Court was adjourned for the day. And overnight, the news that Ranger would be brought into the courtroom traveled through every media outlet in the country like a current through water, fast and unstoppable, and reaching everything it touched. Deputy Webb arrived at the courthouse at 7:30 on day 2. He came in through the side entrance, away from the cameras and the crowd, with Ranger walking at his left side in the quiet, focused way. The dog always moved when he sensed that something important was happening. Webb had learned over 3 years of partnership to trust that Ranger read environments with an accuracy that sometimes exceeded his own. This morning Ranger was calm but alert, his ears up, his pace measured, his dark eyes moving through the corridor with the steady professional attention of an animal that understood work. Webb stopped in the small holding room off the main corridor that had been designated for them and sat on the bench along the wall. Ranger sat beside him and leaned slightly against his leg the way he always did in quiet moments, a small physical reassurance that Webb had come to depend on more than he would ever admit out loud. Patricia Hale came in at 8:15 and sat across from them with her leather notebook open on her knee. "How is he this morning?" she asked, looking at Ranger. "Same as always," Webb said. "Better than me." Hale allowed herself a small smile. Then she became focused and precise the way she always did when she was close to something important. "When you bring him in, walk him in at normal heel," she said. "No commands unless necessary. Let him respond naturally to the environment. That is the entire point." She paused. "Don't perform. Don't demonstrate. Just walk in with your partner the way you do every single day and let the jury see exactly what that looks like." Webb nodded. "And Marcus," she said, using his first name for only the second time in the entire case. "Trust him." Webb looked at Ranger. "I always do," he said. At 9 o'clock, Judge Sims called the court to order and addressed the jury directly before anything else. She explained clearly and precisely what was about to occur and why it had been permitted. She instructed the jury that their observation of the animal was to be treated as they would treat any other form of evidence, with careful attention and without emotional bias in either direction. She instructed the public gallery that any reaction, vocal or physical, would result in immediate removal from the courtroom. She looked at the cameras and reminded their operators of the conditions under which they had been permitted to film. Then she looked at the side door and nodded to the deputy stationed there. The door opened. Deputy Webb walked in with Ranger at perfect heel. The courtroom did not make the noise it wanted to make. It made instead a silence that was somehow louder than noise would have been. The silence of 60 people simultaneously deciding not to react and producing in their collective restraint something that felt like held breath taken to its physical limit. Ranger moved down the center aisle with the same calm authority he had shown entering the building, his paws quiet on the hardwood floor, his body relaxed and controlled, his eyes moving through the room with a steady professional sweep that took in every person, every corner, every unfamiliar smell and sound, and cataloged it all without alarm. He passed the plaintiff's table. Diana Cross sat perfectly still, her expression professionally neutral, her eyes tracking the dog with the careful attention of someone who was watching for exactly what she had argued against. A sign of tension, a moment of unpredictability, any behavior that would support her position that this animal had no place in a room full of people. Ranger gave her nothing. He passed the defense table where Patricia Hale sat with her hands folded and her face composed, and her eyes carrying the particular quiet satisfaction of an attorney who has made a good decision and is watching it unfold exactly as she hoped. Webb brought Ranger to the open space in front of the jury box and stopped. He gave the command to sit. Ranger sat. 14 jurors looked at a 70-pound Belgian Malinois from a distance of approximately 8 feet, and Ranger looked back at them with the calm, direct, uncomplicated attention of an animal that had nothing to hide and no reason to be anything other than exactly what he was. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then something happened that Patricia Hale had hoped for but had not planned, had not scripted, had not coached, because it was the kind of thing that cannot be coached. It either happens or it does not. Juror number 7 was a woman named Margaret Chen, 58 years old, a retired school librarian from the east side of Columbus, who had spent 31 years surrounded by children and books and the particular quality of attention that both require. She had been selected for the jury in part because she had no strong prior opinion about police dogs or K-9 programs, only a general impression that dogs were good and people were complicated. She had watched the video like everyone else. She had felt what everyone else felt. Now she was 8 feet from the real thing. Her hand moved before she had consciously decided to move it. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the small, instinctive reach of a person responding to an animal the way human beings have responded to dogs for thousands of years, with an open hand and an open heart, and the simple hope that the gesture would be received in the spirit it was offered. Her hand was shaking slightly. Ranger looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He stood from his sit, took 2 steps forward, and leaned his head gently and completely into her palm. Margaret Chen closed her eyes. 2 jurors on her left and right reached simultaneously for the tissues in front of them. A 3rd juror, a construction foreman from Grove City, who had entered the trial openly skeptical of what he called emotional manipulation in legal proceedings, pressed his lips together hard and looked at the ceiling. Diana Cross wrote something on her legal pad. Later, her assistant would ask what she had written. She turned the pad so he could see. It said simply, "We lost the room." But the most extraordinary moment was still coming. Because as Deputy Webb prepared to give the command for Ranger to return to heel position, the side door of the courtroom opened unexpectedly, and a small voice cut through the silence of the room with the absolute authority that only complete innocence can produce. "Ranger." Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, having slipped away from her mother in the hallway outside with the same magnificent disregard for barriers she had demonstrated at Riverside Park, was Lily Matthews, curly hair, wide brown eyes, one shoe slightly untied, and a smile so large it filled the entire room. Ranger turned toward the voice, and his tail began to move with a joy so pure and physical and unmistakable that not a single person in that courtroom, not the judge, not the attorneys, not the jury, not the reporters, not the retired judge in the back row with his notepad, could pretend they did not feel it. Judge Sims looked at the small child in the doorway for a long moment. Then she did something that 19 years on the bench had given her the authority and the wisdom to do. She said nothing. She simply let it be. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and 43 minutes. It was not a quick deliberation. It was not the kind that happens when a case is simple, or when minds arrive already made up and only need a room and a formality to confirm what they already believe. It was the kind of deliberation that happens when serious people take a serious responsibility seriously, when they sit around a table and look at each other and understand that what they decide in this room will matter beyond this room, beyond this city, beyond this moment, in ways that none of them can fully predict but all of them can feel. They began deliberating on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:17. They ordered dinner at 6:30, sandwiches and coffee from the courthouse cafeteria, eating at the deliberation table with their notes spread around them and the quiet, focused energy of people in the middle of something important. The foreperson, a 47-year-old logistics manager named Robert Ashby, who had been chosen by the group in the first 10 minutes with a unanimity that surprised even him, ran the proceedings with a calm fairness that kept the conversation moving forward even when it threatened to circle back on itself. There were disagreements, real ones. 2 jurors felt strongly that regardless of the outcome at Riverside Park, the legal question of whether proper protocols had been followed deserved a finding in the plaintiff's favor. They were not unmoved by Ranger. They were not immune to the power of what they had witnessed in the courtroom, but they believed that the law existed precisely to function independently of emotion, and that allowing a touching moment to override a legitimate procedural question was a dangerous precedent to set. 3 other jurors felt equally strongly in the opposite direction, that the evidence presented by the defense had demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that Deputy Webb had acted within his training, within his authority, and within the established guidelines of his department's K-9 outreach program, and that the plaintiff's case, while professionally argued, had ultimately failed to prove negligence in any legally meaningful sense. The remaining 9 jurors sat somewhere between these positions and spent 11 hours moving carefully through the evidence, the testimony, the expert opinions, and their own honest assessments of what they had seen and heard, trying to find the place where the law and the truth met cleanly enough to stand on. Margaret Chen, juror number 7, the retired school librarian whose hand Ranger had leaned into on the second day of trial, was one of the most deliberate voices in the room. She did not argue from emotion. She argued from the documents, from the certification records, from the specific language of the safety protocols, from the timeline of events as established by witness testimony. She had taken more notes than any other juror during the trial, and she referred to them constantly, turning pages with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 decades helping people find information they needed. At 10:42 on Wednesday night, Robert Ashby looked around the table and asked for a final show of hands. 14 hands went up on the same side. He wrote 2 words on the verdict form. Then he folded it, sealed it in the envelope provided, and knocked on the deliberation room door to inform the deputy outside that the jury had reached a verdict. Thursday morning arrived clear and cold. The rain of the previous 2 days had scrubbed the sky clean and left Columbus gleaming under a hard blue October light that made everything look sharp and consequential, which felt appropriate for a day that was both of those things. The line outside the courthouse had formed before dawn. People stood in their coats with coffee cups and quiet conversations, the kind of crowd that gathers not out of hostility, but out of the specific human need to be present when history happens, even when you are not sure exactly what kind of history it will be. Deputy Webb arrived at 7:45. He had not slept well, not badly either, not the sleeplessness of panic or despair, but the light and interrupted sleep of someone whose mind will not fully release its grip on tomorrow even when the body is exhausted. He had lain in the dark for a long time listening to Ranger breathe on his mat across the room and thinking about things that had nothing to do with the verdict and everything to do with it. He thought about the 15 years he had given to this work. He thought about Ranger, about the morning 3 years ago when the dog had been assigned to him as a young 18-month-old animal still sharpening his training, about how long it had taken to build the kind of trust between them that looks effortless from the outside and is anything but from the inside. He thought about Lily Matthews and her juice box in the grass. He thought about how that 30-second moment, that one unrepeatable collision of a child and a dog and a Saturday morning in a park, had led them here, to this building, to this verdict, to whatever was about to happen when those courtroom doors opened, and the foreperson stood up and read 2 words that would travel around the world before lunchtime. He dressed. He fed Ranger. He drove to the courthouse in the early morning quiet with the radio off and both hands on the wheel and Ranger in the back seat, watching the city go by with his steady, unhurried attention. When they arrived, Webb sat in the parked car for a moment. "Whatever happens today," he said to Ranger, "we did the right thing, every step of it." Ranger put his head on the center console. Webb scratched him behind the ear once and got out of the car. The courtroom was different on verdict day. The same room, the same wooden benches, the same high windows letting in the same October light, but charged with something that transformed it from a legal space into something closer to a held breath given physical form. Every seat was filled. The gallery was so quiet that the sound of the court reporter setting up her equipment was clearly audible from the back row. Diana Cross sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, her face composed and unreadable in the way that only years of practice can produce. Patricia Hale sat at the defense table with a single pen in her right hand, and her leather notebook closed in front of her, which Webb noticed and understood meant she had nothing left to prepare for. Webb sat beside her with Ranger secured in the vehicle bay, feeling the absence of the dog beside him the way you feel the absence of something you have come to rely on completely. Judge Patricia Sims entered at 9 o'clock. She sat. She surveyed the room with the same clear, steady gaze she had brought to every moment of this proceeding. Then she nodded to the deputy at the jury room door. The jury filed in. Webb watched their faces the way Patricia Hale had told him to, carefully and without expectation, looking not for smiles or frowns, but for the particular quality of composure that people carry when they have made a decision they believe in. 14 faces. 14 people who had sat in a room for 11 hours and 43 minutes and wrestled honestly with something difficult and come out the other side. Margaret Chen, juror number 7, caught Webb's eye for exactly 1 second as she took her seat. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply looked at him with the calm, direct gaze of someone who has done their job. Webb felt something loosen in his chest. Robert Ashby, the foreperson, stood when Judge Sims asked if the jury had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," he said. He handed the sealed envelope to the court deputy who carried it to the judge. Judge Sims opened it with the brass letter opener from her desk, which Webb would later learn she brought from home every day and had used for every verdict in 19 years of presiding. She read the contents without any change in expression. Then she refolded the paper, placed it back in the envelope, and handed it back to the deputy who returned it to Ashby. "The foreperson will read the verdict," Judge Sims said. Robert Ashby opened the envelope for the second time and looked at the 2 words he had written on that form at 10:42 the previous night. He cleared his throat once. He looked up at the room. He looked back down at the paper. "In the matter of safe spaces for children versus Franklin County," he said, his voice steady and clear in the absolute silence of the room, "we the jury find in favor of the defendant." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the courtroom became everything Judge Sims had spent 19 years preventing it from becoming: loud and human, and completely beyond the reach of a gavel. She struck it anyway, 3 sharp cracks that cut through the noise and brought the room back to order with the authority of someone who has never once doubted her own authority. "There will be order," she said, firmly, finally. Order returned. But Judge Sims was not finished. She set down her gavel and looked at the room over her reading glasses with an expression that was not quite stern and not quite warm, but carried something of both: the expression of a person who has something important to say and intends to say it regardless of whether the moment calls for it. "Before this court is adjourned," she said, "I want to address both parties and the public record directly." She paused, and in that pause the room became as quiet as it had been for the verdict itself. "The legal question before this jury has been answered. The defendant acted within his training, within his authority, and within the established protocols of his department. That finding is clear and it is correct." She let that sit for a moment. "However," she continued, and the word landed with the weight she intended it to carry, "the absence of negligence is not the same as the presence of adequate policy. This case has exposed a genuine gap in the statewide guidelines governing K-9 participation at public community events. That gap does not make Deputy Webb a negligent officer, but it does make our current system an incomplete one." She looked directly at both tables. "I am therefore filing a formal recommendation to the Ohio legislature today calling for the development and adoption of clear, comprehensive, statewide standards for K-9 community outreach programs. This case will be cited as the basis for that recommendation." She removed her glasses from her nose and let them hang on their chain. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down one final time. Deputy Webb sat completely still for a long moment. Patricia Hale placed one hand briefly on his arm. He nodded. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the side door to get his partner. Across the aisle, Diana Cross gathered her documents with precise and unhurried movements. Her associate leaned toward her and said something quietly. She listened, nodded once, and then looked up at the empty bench where Judge Sims had been sitting moments before. "She's right," Cross said quietly, "about the policy." Her associate looked surprised. "We lost the case," Cross said. "We didn't lose the argument." Outside, the October sun was sharp and clean, and the crowd on the courthouse steps received the news with the particular complicated mixture of reactions that honest verdicts always produce in divided audiences: relief and disappointment and acceptance and noise. All of it genuine, all of it human, all of it already being transmitted to the rest of the world in real time. And in the secure vehicle bay 2 corridors away, Ranger stood up from his mat, stretched his front legs forward in a long, slow bow, shook himself once from nose to tail, and waited for the sound of his partner's footsteps coming down the hall. He did not have to wait long. The world moves fast. Stories that consume entire news cycles on Monday are forgotten by Friday, replaced by newer stories with fresher urgency and different faces. The 24-hour machine that had carried Lily and Ranger from a park in Columbus to living rooms across America was already turning toward the next thing before the courthouse steps had fully emptied on verdict day. Satellite trucks pulled away from Mound Street by early afternoon. Camera crews broke down their equipment and loaded it into vans headed for other cities and other stories. The hashtags that had trended for 2 weeks began their natural slow fade into the background noise of the internet. Still there, but quieter, visited less frequently, gradually becoming the kind of thing people stumble across months later and feel a small warm recognition toward before scrolling on. But some stories do not fade. Some stories finish their time in the loud center of public attention and then do something quieter and more lasting. They settle into the fabric of the places they came from and the lives of the people they touched, and they keep growing there in the slow, patient way that real things grow, without cameras, without hashtags, without anyone watching except the people living it. This was one of those stories. Deputy Marcus Webb returned to work the Monday after the verdict. He came in at his usual time, 7:45, with his coffee and his partner, and he walked through the front door of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department the same way he had walked through it for 15 years, without ceremony and without expectation. His colleagues greeted him the way colleagues greet someone who has been through something difficult and come out the right side of it, with the particular combination of respect and normalcy that says we see what you carried, and we are glad you are back, and we will not make you talk about it more than you want to. Captain Torres stopped him in the hallway. "You have a request," she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a letter from the principal of Eastmore Elementary School on the east side of Columbus, asking if Deputy Webb and Ranger might be available to visit the school for a community education day. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and professionally written, and at the very bottom, below the principal's signature, there was a line of crayon drawings that the kindergarten class had added themselves, uneven and colorful and completely wonderful, 14 small dogs drawn by 14 small hands, each one slightly different and all of them clearly meant to be Ranger. Webb folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket. "Tell them yes," he said. That visit led to another, and another after that. Within 6 weeks of the verdict, Webb and Ranger had visited 11 schools across Franklin County. Within 3 months, they had been to 26. The format was always the same: Webb in uniform, Ranger in his working vest, a gymnasium or a classroom full of children who had usually seen the video, and arrived with the particular excitement of people meeting someone they already feel they know. Webb would talk about his work, about Ranger's training, about what it means to be a working dog and what it means to be a partner, and how those two things are not as different from each other as they might seem. Then he would show them how to approach a dog safely, how to ask permission, how to read an animal's body language, how to understand the difference between a dog that is comfortable and a dog that is not. And then, at the end of every single visit, Ranger would do what Ranger always did in the presence of children who approached him correctly and carefully, and with open, honest hands. He would sit down. He would lower his head. And he would let them love him. The photographs from those visits filled the bulletin boards of 26 schools. Teachers reported that children who had previously been afraid of dogs began asking their parents for pets. School counselors noted that several students with anxiety disorders had shown measurable improvement in sessions that incorporated discussions about the trial and Ranger's temperament. A child psychologist in Columbus wrote a paper about it that was published in a professional journal and cited in 3 subsequent studies. None of that was planned. None of it was a program or a strategy or an initiative. It was simply what happens when something true gets loose in the world and people start building on it. Claire Matthews launched Paws and Protection 4 months after the verdict. She had not planned to start a nonprofit. She was a dental hygienist and a single mother, and she had approximately no experience with organizational management, fundraising, grant writing, or the particular brand of exhausting optimism that running a nonprofit requires. What she had was a story, a daughter, and the specific kind of stubborn conviction that forms in a person when they have been through something that could have broken them, and discovered instead that it made them clearer about what they believed. She believed that the connection between children and working animals, when managed responsibly and approached with genuine care, was not a liability. It was a resource. It was something that could build trust between communities and the people who served them in ways that no policy manual or public statement ever could. She started small: a website, a social media page, a formal partnership with the Franklin County Sheriff's Department that Deputy Webb helped her negotiate over 3 meetings at a coffee shop on High Street while Ranger waited in Webb's truck outside and the barista kept bringing extra dog treats to the window. Within the first year, Pause and Protection had partnered with 7 law enforcement agencies across Ohio to develop responsible K-9 community outreach guidelines, the very guidelines that Judge Sims had called for in her courtroom remarks on verdict day. Within the second year, the organization had expanded into 4 additional states. Within 3 years, it had become the primary resource cited by the Ohio legislature when it passed the statewide K-9 community outreach standards that Judge Sims had recommended, the first comprehensive legislation of its kind in the country. When the bill was signed into law in the governor's office in Columbus, Claire Matthews was in the room. She was standing near the back, slightly overwhelmed and slightly underdressed and completely certain that she did not belong there, until the governor looked up from the signing table and said her name and thanked her directly, and the room applauded, and Claire pressed both hands over her mouth the way she had in that park on a Saturday morning when her daughter walked toward a police dog, and the world held its breath. Lily was with her that day. She was 5 years old by then, tall for her age, still curly-haired, still possessed of the magnificent fearlessness that had started everything. She stood beside her mother in a yellow dress with white shoes and held Ranger Jr., the stuffed dog she had carried everywhere since the day after Riverside Park, pressed against her chest with both arms. When the room applauded, she looked around at all the clapping adults with the serene confidence of a child who does not fully understand what is happening, but is entirely comfortable being at the center of it. On the drive home from the governor's office, Claire glanced in the rearview mirror at her daughter in the car seat. Lily was looking out the window at the city going by, Ranger Jr., tucked under one arm, her other hand resting in her lap, her expression calm and content and completely at peace with the world. "Lily," Claire said. Lily looked up at the mirror and found her mother's eyes in it. "Do you know how brave you were," Claire asked, "that day at the park?" Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "I wasn't brave," she said finally. Claire frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Brave is when you're scared but you do it anyway," Lily said, with the matter-of-fact authority of a 5-year-old who has clearly been thinking about this. "I wasn't scared. I just wanted to say hi." Claire laughed until her eyes filled with tears. In the lobby of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, on the wall beside the main entrance where every officer and visitor and delivery person passes every single day, there is a framed photograph. It is not a large frame. It is not dramatic or ornate. It is a simple dark wood frame, the kind you can buy anywhere, holding an 8x10 print of a photograph taken by a father named Daniel Hooper on a Saturday morning in Riverside Park when the world was warm and the grass was green, and a 3-year-old girl with curly hair placed her small hands on the head of a 70-pound police dog, and neither one of them was afraid. Beneath the photograph, a small brass plate is fixed to the wall. It reads, "She wasn't afraid, and neither was he." Every new officer who joins the Franklin County Sheriff's Department walks past that photograph on their first day. Most of them stop and look at it for a moment. Some of them smile. Some of them feel something they cannot name but recognize, the particular feeling of being reminded why the work matters, why showing up matters, why the small moments of genuine connection between people and the ones who serve them are not distractions from the job but the very heart of it. Deputy Marcus Webb walks past it every morning at 7:45. He has never once walked past it without looking. And Ranger, walking at perfect heel on his left side, always seems to slow his pace just slightly at that spot in the hallway, as though he too is pausing for something, though of course that is impossible to know for certain, and Webb has never claimed to know it for certain. He has only said, when asked about it in the occasional interview he still reluctantly gives, that Ranger has always had a way of knowing things, and that he has learned, over 3 years and 1 lawsuit and 11 million views and 26 school visits and 1 changed law and 1 small girl in a yellow dress, to trust that completely. Some stories begin with a little girl dropping her juice box. Some of those stories change the world. And the best ones, the ones that last, the ones that matter beyond the noise and the cameras and the verdicts and the legislation, the best ones end not with a gavel or a headline or a hashtag, but with something much simpler and much more enduring. A dog, a child, and a photograph on a wall that nobody ever walks past without stopping to feel, just for a moment, that the world is capable of being exactly as good as we need it to be. The end.